I want to let you know that if I was to happen to get arrested over the next few weeks, there's a perfectly good explanation. I've been reading this passage. I've been thinking all about this coup d'etat by Absalom, and it got me thinking, why is it in history that some coups work and some coups don't? Why is it, for example, 1969, some of you might remember this, Colonel Gaddafi is able to just sort of march in and seize power, but 1991 in Moscow, the plotters weren't able to do that. Why is it that in 2016, the president of Turkey was never seriously threatened, and yet 3 years earlier, the president of Egypt never stood a chance? And so I decided, why don't I do some Googling? And I suppose I'm starting to wonder if typing how to overthrow the government into Google maybe isn't such a good idea. You never know, they might watch some of the sermons on YouTube. They might be watching you because you're associating with me. But why is it that some rebellions work and some rebellions don't? Why is it that some rulers manage to keep power for years and years and years, and some leaders end up losing everything overnight? Well, from what I've read, very often it comes down to whether or not they're able to keep the movers and shakers on board. And men like, the commanders of the army, or the keepers of the treasury, or the owners of the media. And if they are able to keep these men as their friends, well, then they're able to keep their throne. And that actually is the big question that's facing David in this passage. Can he keep his throne? And the answer is, it depends on whether he can keep his friends. And so this morning we're going to think about 3 of David's friends. And the first one we see is a friend who stabs him in the back. A friend who stabs him in the back. And right away, chapter 16, verse 15, we see that this guy really, really matters. He's very prominently featured in this verse. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. And this, for David, is about as big a blow as you can possibly imagine, because Ahithophel was an extremely talented man. Ahithophel really had everything that you could possibly be looking for in a chief of staff. He was really, really smart. He knew how to get things done. And he's not simply a man who played chess. He's a man who played 3D chess. And he was always 5 moves ahead. And if you have got Ahithophel on your team, if he is your friend, if he is working for you, you have got a massive advantage. Notice how Ahithophel's described in chapter 16, verse 23. Now in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So, it's the Bible itself saying this. There's almost something godlike about Ahithophel and how wise he is. And Ahithophel was David's friend, but now he's not. Now he's Absalom's friend. And that's a big problem. And so Ahithophel gets to work, and he starts immediately telling Absalom what he ought to do if he wants to secure the throne. And this actually, it ties right in with some of what I read about why some coups work and some coups don't. So apparently, if you're going to try and overthrow the government, one of the most important things you need to do is you need to create the illusion that you've already done it, that you've already won. Because most people aren't going to support you if they think there's a chance there's going to be repercussions. It's only once people think that it's already done and dusted, that you have already won, that they're going to come in behind you and they're going to give you their support. And that's why, I'm sure some of you will know, the very first thing very often that the leaders of a coup will do is they'll take over the TV studios. And they'll go on TV and they'll look all official and they'll give an address to the nation. And the whole point is they're trying to tell you we're already in charge. Well, thousands of years ago, no TV, of course. But Ahithophel has got a way of letting the whole nation know that Absalom is actually in charge. And we see it in chapter 16, verse 21 and verse 22. So David has left, but he has left concubines behind in the palace. Sort of, not quite wives, but a bit like wives, sort of live-in lovers that many kings had. We'll not get into that. David is wrong to have this. But Ahithophel's plan was that Absalom was to sleep with these women. And notice where Absalom is to do this in verse 22. He's to do it on the roof of the palace. In other words, he's to do it somewhere that everybody is going to see. And by doing that, it's going to send a really clear message. It's going to say, these women belong to me because I am now the king. Right. It's a scandalous thing to do. It's a wicked thing to do. But you can't deny it's actually really smart. And it means that Absalom is well on his way to getting the people to come behind him. That's the first part of Ahithophel's plan. He has a second part as well. And this second part is hopefully going to settle things once and for all. And actually, we have a term for this strategy today. Today, military figures, they would call this a decapitation strategy. In other words, you cut off the head and the body dies. You take out the leadership and the followers are going to melt away. So for example, round about this time last year, it's exactly the strategy that Russia was trying to use in Ukraine. And the whole idea was, if they can just take Zelensky out, then the war is going to end. Well, that's what Ahithophel is trying to do here. He is trying to get Absalom to take David out, because he knows that if he takes David out, there's going to be no rival to the throne, there's going to be nothing left to fight for, and it's going to be done and dusted. Perfect strategy. It's exactly the sort of masterstroke that you would expect this really shrewd, really ingenious man to come up with. And he's thought through the practicalities as well. Ahithophel knows that David has had to leave Jerusalem in a hurry. He knows that he's disorganised, he knows that he's exhausted, and he knows that he's in no fit state to defend himself. And so Ahithophel says, I'm going to deal with it. I will gather up a troop of men. I will lead an expedition out into the desert. I will track David down. I will find him. I'll cut off his head. And that'll be that. Done and dusted. Like I say, Ahithophel is 5 moves ahead. And this is exactly the right strategy. And even if you know nothing about military history, you know this is the right strategy because that's what God tells us in this passage. And if Absalom can just listen to Ahithophel, if he can just follow his advice, it's curtains for David. It's going to be the end. And so we have a massive blow in this passage because David has a friend who stabs him in the back. Secondly, though, there's a friend who's undercover. There's a friend who's undercover. Now, we've already met David's friend Hushai back in chapter 15. We see his story in verse 32 through to verse 37. But basically, Hushai is incredibly loyal to David. And he's so loyal that he's willing to leave everything in Jerusalem behind, and he's willing to go on the run and be with David in the desert. But David says no. David says, actually, Hushai, you would be of far more help to me if you were to stay in Jerusalem. If you were to serve Absalom, and you were to be my man on the inside. And so Hushai agrees to this. Hushai basically agrees to become a secret agent working in the palace. And so the question is, will Hushai be able to do it? Will he be able to worm his way in, or is he going to be exposed? It all seems to hang on a knife edge in verse 16 of chapter 16. Hushai comes along to Absalom. What does he say? He says, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And when you think about it, he's certainly choosing his words carefully, isn't he? Because on face value, it sounds as though Hushai is throwing his weight behind Absalom. But who does he really mean when he says, the king? Well, it's David, of course. Absalom, though, he's not entirely buying it first. We can see that he's quite suspicious in verse 17. Here's this guy. He's loyal to David, and all of a sudden he's turning his back on his friend. Does that really make sense? He asks in verse 17, is this the love you show for your friend? Why don't you go with your friend? And Hushai answers in verse 18. And this answer that Hushai gives, it's an absolute masterpiece in technically telling the truth, but telling it in such a way that the person you're telling it to is going to draw their own conclusions. And so verse 18, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Who's been chosen by the Lord? Who's been chosen by all the people? It's David, of course. But Absalom, with all his hair, he's so vain, isn't he, that he assumes it must be me. And so Hushai, David's secret agent, has managed to sneak his way right in to Absalom's command room. And as we see in these two chapters, Hushai has got two objectives. The first objective, and I don't know if any of you read any John le Carre novels, this is just like something out of that. He's to try and sneak intelligence out from the palace, and he's to try and get it to David. And he's got this whole system of agents and rendezvous and hidden wells in the desert and all of the rest. And he's going to use that to try and get the intelligence out. But the second objective, if it's at all possible, he's to try and bring this new regime down from the inside. And he's to do that by trying to trick Absalom into making a tactical blunder. And immediately he gets his chance. So we've seen Ahithophel's plan. He's going to get a squadron together. He's going to march right out into the desert. He's going to do it while David is at his most vulnerable, and he's going to finish the job. And we've already seen this is actually really, really sound military advice from Ahithophel. The question now is, can Hushai persuade Absalom to do the opposite of what Ahithophel says? At the minute, Shorty knows this, I love military history. At the minute I'm reading a book, it's all about the fighting in Normandy in World War II. And one of the things it keeps on bringing home is the massive problems that the Allies had, because whenever the Germans were on the retreat and whenever they were off balance, they just weren't able to keep on going. They weren't able to strike them whenever they were vulnerable. And again they had to keep sort of pulling back, and the Germans were able to reorganise, and it was a bloodbath because of that. And that's been true all across the history of military history. If the enemy's able to get reorganised, if he's able to dig in again, it tends to be disastrous. And Ahithophel knows this. He knows that now is the time to strike. David is vulnerable. You need to get it done. But now Hushai wants to persuade Absalom to do the opposite. And so here's his chance. Because something really surprising happens. Absalom loved Ahithophel's plan. He thought it was a great plan. But he's having second thoughts. And so in verse 5 of chapter 17, he summons Hushai. And now everything hangs on this. Can Hushai get Absalom to do something stupid? Can he get him to make that classic military blunder of allowing the enemy to regroup? And so Hushai starts to plant fear in Absalom's mind. Absalom, you know that David is a wily one. You know that he's experienced when it comes to fighting. What's going to happen if your men can't find him? Or even worse, what happens if your men are looking for him and David is able to spring a trap? And he's going to kill some of your men. He's going to send them packing. Absalom, think about it. You've only just got the throne. If people hear that your men have been trounced by David in the desert, you're going to look like a loser. You're not going to look like someone that people should throw their weight behind. No one is going to be brave enough to stick with you. Absalom, it's going to be over before it starts. And so Hushai, instead, he comes up with a different plan. He says, Absalom, take your time. Wait. And instead of sending Ahithophel into the desert with a relatively small battalion, why don't you take your time and gather up the most enormous army that the country has ever seen? Why don't you wait until you have the most intimidating, most overwhelming force that you could possibly muster, and then you can go. And you'll know when you have an army of that size that you can't possibly lose. And it's a masterpiece. It really is a masterpiece. You read this plan again later on. You read Hushai's speech again later on. Notice, for one thing, how vivid it is. Notice all the word pictures, all of the drama that he manages to sneak in. Is it any wonder that he got Absalom's attention? As well as that, though, I think there's another reason that Hushai managed to get Absalom hooked. You see, Ahithophel's plan was the better plan, but it was all about Ahithophel, wasn't it? He was going to strike the decisive blow. He knew that Absalom's most important place to be was at home in the palace. He was going to strike the decisive blow. But here's Hushai, and he's painting a picture for Absalom in verse 11. And the picture is of Absalom riding out at the head of this massive army. And we know how vain Absalom was, and we know he's bound to have been playing this scene out in his head. And there he is in his imagination, and he's riding out, and those long flowing locks, they're sort of blowing in the wind as he rides out, and Absalom's the hero, and he's the one who's going to strike the decisive blow, and he's going to win the victory. It's a masterpiece from Hushai. And Absalom's hooked. And so he does the unthinkable. He makes the very worst mistake he could possibly make. Instead of striking when David is vulnerable, he listens to David's very own 007 and he makes a blunder. And if you want a mark of just how deliberately terrible this plan was, just look at what Ahithophel does next in verse 23. Very calmly, very meticulously, he gets his house in order and he hangs himself. because he knows the writings on the wall. He knows that this was the one opportunity to get it done. And he knows that Absalom has blown it. And he knows above all that he's picked the wrong guy. He stabbed his friend in the back, and his friend is going to win. And there's no doubt in his mind whatsoever. It's a good job that David had an undercover friend, because Hushai has just saved David's skin. And he's got other friends too. There's other friends I'd love to talk about in the chapter. There's the man and that woman who risk their lives as part of the intelligence network. And there's those men at the end of the chapter who come out into the wilderness and bring David supplies. I'd love to spend time thinking about those friends. We just don't have time to do that this morning. So instead, we're going to look at one final friend. So we've seen already a friend who stabs David in the back, a friend who's undercover. Thirdly, we see David's greatest friend of all. David's greatest friend of all. How is it that David manages to survive even though he was right on the brink? How is it that Hushai manages to get his advice listened to even though everybody knew that Ahithophel was a total genius? Well, it's all because behind the scenes there's an even better friend. A friend who is making sure that this is not the end for David. And we get a few hints of that. One hint we saw in chapter 16, Absalom sleeping with these women in public view. We can't help but think back to chapter 12. And Nathan confronted David, and he told David that one of the consequences of his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah was that someone close to him would lie with his wives in broad daylight. And so even as Absalom is doing something utterly shameless, utterly wicked, even as he is rebelling against God's anointed, all he's managing to do is to fulfill the very word that God spoke just 4 chapters ago. We see as well a hint of this in chapter 15 and verse 31. So David understands how big a mess he's in. He realises Ahithophel's calling the shots. That's really bad news. And so he prays, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." That's verse 31. Who shows up in the very next verse? As if by magic, there's Hushai. Or more to the point, as if God has just answered prayer. There's Hushai. And then in chapter 16, Hushai is able to sort of inveigle his way into Absalom's inner circle. And yes, Absalom's vanity plays a part. And yes, his natural cautiousness plays a part. And yes, of course, Hushai's word pictures play a very big part. But there's one reason more than any other why Absalom listened to Hushai instead of Ahithophel. And it's chapter 17 and verse 14. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. It's God who did it. But why? Why does God care whether this coup wins or this coup fails? Well, I'm like a stuck record, broken record. It all comes down to the covenant with David. What is it we keep on talking about? God's chesed. His never-ending, unbreakable covenant love. God has pledged himself to be David's friend. And because he's pledged himself to be David's friend, he is never, ever, ever going to let David down. And yes, we've seen over and over the last few weeks, David is mucked up badly. And yet God is not going to allow this to derail his promise. He has promised David that he will sit on the throne. And no one, whether it's Ahithophel, whether it's Absalom, whether it is anybody else, is going to undo God's promise. God is David's greatest friend. But we can also go further. And again, you've heard me and Mark, we've said this many, many times. God's covenant with David was about more than just David. It was about David's most brilliant descendant. And as we know, that is Jesus. And so, never in a million years is God going to allow Absalom's plot to succeed. Never in a million years is God going to allow anything to happen that's going to risk his promise of sending a Messiah. Because God is David and our greatest friend. And that should give us confidence. It should give us confidence in the friendship of God. Isn't that what Jesus says to his followers? I've called you my friends. It should give us confidence in the covenant that God makes with us. He tells us his chesed, his never-ending covenant love, his never-ending faithfulness is never going to let us down. He tells us he's going to see those promises through right to the very end. Should this chapter not give us confidence when we go through difficult times? Here's David. He's in the desert. He is waiting for that hammer blow, for that blitzkrieg that's going to end it all. And he doesn't know what's happening in Absalom's HQ. But he's just waiting for the hammer to strike. And yet, in the palace, there's God, secretly, subtly making sure that he keeps his word. Doesn't that give us hope? There's plenty of times we can't see what God's doing. There's plenty of times it's like we're in the desert. We're vulnerable. We don't know what's coming next. We can't see what God's doing. Doesn't mean God isn't working. Doesn't this passage give us confidence as we think of the kingdom of Jesus? There's times we look at the church and then we look outside. We look at the evil of the world around us and it seems like we're fighting a losing battle. It seems like there's just no way that truth and light are ever going to survive. Well, here's God showing us. When it comes to the king's kingdom, he is going to keep it right to the very end. And more than anything else, we should be so thankful for the real king. A king who was stabbed in the back by one of his closest friends. A king who was hunted down by evil men. And yet a king that knew that even in the midst of all of that, his father's hand was at work. A king who knew that what looked like a total disaster was always going to end with incredible triumph. Shouldn't we be so thankful for King Jesus? The one God promised. The one God made a covenant with. The one who was betrayed by one of his closest friends. And yet the one who even today is bringing men and women, boys and girls just like us, into his kingdom. Should we not be so thankful? Our king isn't like Absalom. He's not vain. He's not pompous. He's not in it for what he can get. but he's wise. He's generous. And he puts his people first. Should we not be so thankful that King Jesus says to you this morning, if you're not yet a member of his kingdom, he says to you, you can come to me and you can experience all of these blessings, all the blessings of being part of the covenant, all the blessings of being in my kingdom. You can come to me. You can bow the knee, and every single one of them is going to be yours. So the question is, whose side are you on? Are you on Absalom's side, or are you on David's side? Are you with the king, or are you rebelling against him? You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You want to make sure you've come before King Jesus and you've experienced these blessings for yourself.